Hi, everyone. Mustafa Santiago Ali here, Vice President at the National Wildlife Federation for Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization. It's an honor to hold space with everyone, to have so many amazing leaders to join with us here at the Clean Economy of Color Coalition. We started this with a number of other partners because we knew how incredibly important it was for our communities to be prepared, to be able to fully move forward on all of the sets of opportunities that the clean economy will afford us, but also to be able to highlight individuals who are already doing amazing work in this space, and also have those real talk conversations about some of the challenges that may still exist and how we can navigate them together. This coalition gives us an opportunity to make sure that when we talk about this transformational moment, to make sure that it makes and has real meaning for our communities, especially our most vulnerable communities of color, African American, Latinx, Asian and Pacific Islander, Indigenous brothers and sisters, and others who have often been unseen and unheard and had a difficult time in being able to get traction in a number of different areas. So we want to thank you. I also want to thank the Mattaponi and the Pamunkey, whose land I currently reside on, for allowing me to hold space, and all the other tribes and nations that are represented by many of our participants and others who also are residing on their lands. We want to make sure that we're always calling out that the first principle of the environmental justice movement is honoring Mother Earth. And we make sure that we live that each and every day in the work that we do and in the partnerships that we develop. So we want to thank you for joining us. We have just some incredible individuals who are going to be sharing some information that you don't want to miss. So if you're old school, make sure that you get your pencil or your pen and piece of paper, or make sure that you also have the opportunity to take down some of this just really needed information that will be shared by our panelists today. And with that being said, I'm going to ask everyone real quickly to also fill out the poll that we have. It helps us to, one, do a better job. It helps us to also have an understanding of who's with us. We operate in an intergenerational fashion here, making sure that we are honoring all the young people, all that innovation, ingenuity, and energy that you bring to making change happen. And we also honor our elders, the wisdom that exists in that space. So we ask you to fill the poll out as we begin to move forward. And as you do that, I want to also begin to just let everyone know that in this moment, we know, because we believe in real talk here, that when we talk about the clean economy, less than 2% of the businesses that are owned in that space at this moment are owned by African Americans, Latinx, and Indigenous brothers and sisters. And we also know that we have to make sure that that dynamic changes also, because we know that not only does representation matter, but that we have many of the solutions that are necessary for our communities. And of course, these immense set of opportunities that are in front of us will play a critical role. We're going to have in one moment Colin O'Mara join us, who is the president of the National Wildlife Federation. I'm lucky to be able to call him a friend, and he is also one of those folks who really knows the insides and the outsides of what's going on in Capitol Hill and state houses and across our country. So with that being said, I want to turn it over and pass the mic to Colin O'Mara.
Hey, everybody. Sorry, I'm coming at you from just outside of DC. Just kind of took my suit off because I had to get out of it after being in it all day. But I just want to say how much I appreciate you all, and that I think I come bearing good news. We are close to hopefully in the next few hours, if not maybe tomorrow morning, having an agreement that's going to lead towards upwards of $500 billion of investments in the clean economy. We're talking about $555 billion. Now, what does that really mean? I mean, at a very high level, one of the things that this administration and the Congress have been trying to do is make a lot of these programs that, frankly, haven't been accessible for folks more accessible. It's making sure. The number of folks in the administration that Mustafa's just informed that they're not educated, I guess is probably a better word, that less than 2% of all clean energy companies are owned by people of color, and folks recognizing that's a problem. That we don't just create jobs, we want to create wealth. And so what you're going to see in this package as it comes out is changes of a whole magnitude in the way that clean energy is financed, the types of companies that can participate, really trying to, sorry, I got some kids screaming in the background, really trying to make sure that the complexity of previous iterations, where it's mostly tax credits, where you had to have a lot of tax liability or knew somebody that did, be able to take advantage, turning those into grants, having a lot of consumer grants so folks can buy things like more efficient appliances. Folks can have healthier heating and cooling systems, healthier stoves, adopting things like solar or other renewable energy, trying to make that more affordable. Another big push is on electric vehicles. They're going to be encouraging folks to give higher incentives if they use cars that are made in the U.S., cars that are made with good wages in the U.S. They're also going to have tax credits for folks that want to buy a used electric vehicle to make it more affordable for more people. And so, there's a lot that's available. And so I would just encourage you, as you're listening to this panel, as you're talking to folks, think about those business opportunities. I mean, you have some of the leading business leaders on this call, but it's one thing to reduce emissions. It's something else to actually reduce emissions in a way that create more prosperity and more wealth, and do it in a way that's going to build communities and really strengthen folks. And so, Mustafa's been leading the charge. I am proud to say that of all the things that got cut in this package, and there's a lot of cutting. They went from 3.5 trillion down to about 1.5 trillion. The environmental justice investments in things like lead pipes, things like cleaner ports, things like reducing diesel emissions, things like trying to clean up school buses, like all of that stuck. And so a lot of money for Superfund sites. So a lot of money is going to be going into communities to try to help make them healthier and reducing air and water and soil pollution. The clean energy incentives are really designed to encourage more entrepreneurship and more businesses. There's a tax credit, for example, that the federal government's going to pay up to 30% of the business cost of getting started in the space if folks want to make kind of clean energy products. And so there's a lot of opportunity. And so we'll have a lot more details coming out to share with everybody as it's coming. But the bottom line that I just want to share with you all is I just want to thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for your expertise. Thanks for your passion for both doing well and doing good at the same time. I think there's a lot of opportunity here. And again, this isn't enough. Big promises were made around environment. 40% of the investments going towards environmental justice. We'll have to see whether that's actually realized. There's a lot of opportunity, a lot of talk about innovation, entrepreneurship, and small business ownership. We'll have to make sure that becomes real. And we're going to have to all work together to make sure that the money that is spent, and some of which is going to fall to the states, actually winds up in the communities and the places and spaces that need it most. And so I hope you enjoyed today's session. I can't say enough about the leadership of Mustafa and Simone and Rebecca and the entire dream team, as we call them at the National Wildlife Federation. But the good news is on the way. And again, I don't want to sugarcoat it. Mustafa's telling me to always give real talk. The investments that in the package aren't enough. We're still going to have to do more to get to 50% reductions. But at the end of the day, this is a huge, huge down payment. And there's opportunities to strengthen communities, help folks get a little healthier, and revitalize places that have been left behind for too long. So I'm honored to be with you all. I appreciate the opportunity. I look forward to listening to the presentations tonight.
Thank you so much, Colin. And thank you, too, to Dr. Ali. Hello to everyone. I am Simone Lightfoot, our Associate Vice President of Environmental Justice and Climate Justice here at the National Wildlife Federation. It's so great to have some of our returning participants join us, and welcome to our new guests. Please stay in touch by joining our listserv. The National Wildlife Federation Environmental Justice Program has hosted a series of virtual convenings this year to take a deeper dive into the challenges and opportunities associated with developing a clean economy that centers equity and justice for communities of color. In addition, we have also addressed how to amplify equitable practices and policies to inform a civilian climate core, and how to expand business ownership and economic inclusion in collaboration with communities of color. From these discussions, we continue to distill information to share 10 key themes and points of interest that we would like to share with you all. We, for instance, want to increase business ownership and opportunities for people of color. Those priorities that are important, job sustainability and training is important for us to make sure that we are addressing technology and workforce development. Addressing barriers to access is important. Considering community revitalization, gentrification, public lands, wildlife protection, and infrastructure investments in communities of color. Increasing representation at all levels of decision-making in collaboration with communities of color. Expanding education, culturally competent materials, the arts, and inclusive messaging by, from, and for communities of color. Incorporating youth engagement and inclusion, protecting voting, civil rights, safe spaces, and enforcement. Addressing concerns around agriculture, food, public health, and wellness in collaboration with communities of color. And last, creating metrics, defining language, and accountability mechanisms for an equitable, clean economy transition. These themes and priorities are continuously evolving to ensure we capture the nuanced opportunities and challenges that communities face as they engage in the clean economy. As negotiations continue to take place in Congress, like you've heard from Colin, we must not forget the impact of these investments on frontline and fence line communities. For example, in Benton Harbor, Michigan, funds earmarked to upgrade and replace lead pipes are instrumental as residents face catastrophic amounts of lead in their homes. In Mount Vernon, New York, city officials are dealing with decades of wastewater infrastructure issues and unique barriers to applying for federal funding. So there's a mighty work ahead for each of us that requires an all hands on deck approach. So please stay up to date with our Clean Economy Coalition of Color. Please add your name and email address in the chat. We would love to add you to our listserv. That's so important to stay in touch. I'm going to now turn it over to our visionary leader and Vice President, Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali.
Thank you, Simone. Appreciate the update and the information that you shared. We're going to be moving now to our amazing panelists. I'm looking forward to hearing the information that they shared. The first person that I'm going to go to is Dana Johnson. As I pass the mic to her, I just want to call out my brother's name, Cecil Corbin Mark, whom, if he was still with us, unfortunately, he was taken way too soon, would be on top of all of these policy conversations, all of these opportunities in the economic part of what's going on and the public health. So as WEAC continues to do amazing, amazing work, we just want to make sure that we're also lifting him up, because his spirit, I know, is not only here with us tonight watching over us, but all these other conversations that are happening from environmental justice and climate justice leaders across the planet. With that being said, I'm going to turn it over to my sister, Ms. Johnson. And maybe you can share a little bit about who you are, what WEAC does, and your insights also on both the bipartisan infrastructure and the Build Back Better agenda.
Yes. My name is Dana Johnson. I do serve as Senior Director of Strategy and Federal Policy with WEAC for Environmental Justice. And I do so much appreciate that acknowledgement of Cecil in this moment. I feel myself getting a little tingly here, because we are acknowledging the year since his passing. And Cecil, for me, was an incredible, brilliant strategist. And I very often find myself in this moment thinking about what would Cecil do. Mm-hmm. And so this is a wonderful, robust moment, as Colin mentioned, and as you mentioned. We are focused on the bipartisan infrastructure package as well as the Build Back Better Act. And we have a commitment to both of those things staying together. We want them to move in tandem, because there is a lot of money in the infrastructure package that will lead to a myriad of projects taking place in communities where people of color live and areas of low income. We saw investment in public transportation and workforce development. We saw it in the electrification of school buses. So there is opportunity for us to reduce our carbon footprint. But I have to be honest and say it's quite disappointing to see how NEPA was, the National Environmental Policy Act, was positioned in the bipartisan infrastructure package. It was weakened in a way that could do great harm to communities. as these infrastructure projects roll out. And so that's why, as people appropriately categorize the Build Back Better Act, is the people's bill, if you will. There are provisions in there, as Colin mentioned, related to environmental justice. There are provisions related to the myriad of opportunities as we transition from a fossil fuel economy to one that is less polluting and does not center the climate crises in our communities. There's opportunity for legacy cleanup, for EJ block grants, for air pollution mitigation. But we want to make sure that there isn't, and I don't know what's going to happen in terms of what Colin said. We are watching to see what investments look like in what we call false solutions. So we don't want to prolong our dependence on fossil fuels. And so adding clean in front of technologies that really don't improve air pollution, water pollution, land pollution, if they don't lead to better economic conditions in our communities, then we would have concern with that. And so, we want investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency programs and electrification, transportation and goods movement. And then we want a holistic approach at how we transition individuals, households, and communities from a fossil fuel economy to this, whether we call it green jobs or green economy. We want our communities to benefit robustly and holistically. And so that's our focus as well.
All right. I appreciate that real talk. Thank you for breaking it down. We're going to be coming back to you here shortly, but I want to move to our second panelist, Teresa Cardenas, and allow you to introduce yourself, share who and the organization that you represent, and then also a little bit about both the bipartisan infrastructure and Build Back Better.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me. I am in the beautiful state of Nuevo Mexico. People come here for, to see our beautiful skies and our beautiful land and our beautiful people. It's, very indigenous here. We have majority minority state, so we're happy to really have indigenous people mixed in with Hispanics and African Americans, and we're just this great, wonderful state. And we also have this beautiful sun that we now take advantage of because of more renewable energy. We can deploy it here, and it's very successful. So I am a civic engagement and policy manager for New Mexico First, and we are primarily a policy institute. But what I do is I engage community. That means all community. We are a bipartisan organization. So all of the policies we work on, we make sure that there are voices coming from everyone. My specialty is the environment and agricultural resilience. We have a lot of agriculture here in New Mexico that goes back many years to indigenous times. And we want to make sure that we have this resilient, strong agricultural connection to the land, to our water, and to our air. I'm located in the village of Los Ranchos, which is a part of Albuquerque on Tiwe land. Wanted to recognize our indigenous lands here in New Mexico. So I speak on my own behalf. These specific policies that I work on are agricultural, but they do connect very well with the Build Back Better. But I'm going to focus more on renewable energy, clean energy.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. So let's begin to dive right in. Dana, I heard you very clearly that we need to stop our addiction to fossil fuels. Can you talk a little bit about some of the investments that you think would have the greatest impact inside of our communities? I know you're there in New York, and I know that there are sets of needs both in the rural and urban context. WEAC works with a number of different organizations across the country. So love to hear your ideas on just a handful of things that you think could really be transformative.
Yep. I forgot to mention, we are based in Harlem, New York. That's where we were founded. We have had a presence here in Washington, D.C. for a little more than 10 years. And in our federal policy office, we do convene an alliance of environmental justice groups called the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum. So I think within this energy context, there are a couple of things that we've looked at. We've looked at tax credits for renewable energy projects in environmental justice communities. And we think about that in the context of we have a worker development program that supports individuals in becoming fully employed and having them work on renewable energy projects. And out of that was born a worker cooperative, SUNS, and it is owned by the African-American men and women who went through our workforce development program. They're entrepreneurs. So we want to make sure that they have the resources to go out and bid on projects, to have the capital that they need in order to scale up those projects, and to really be able to attract larger projects where they get to hire other people and invest back in the community. And so that included, under that renewable umbrella, we are looking at funding for solar installation and community solar at households. We are looking at weatherization assistance programs because we know that in low to moderate income households, 30% of a person's income could go to housing, but another 2 to 30% could go toward energy. And so we want to do as much as we can to reduce energy burden in communities, and we are focused in that way. And then we also want to look at industry and sectors. And so anything that invests in electric, zero emission, heavy duty trucks, our public transportation system, school buses, zero emission port equipment, including charging stations, anything that can reduce the amount of carbon that we have being pushed out in our communities is important. But I got to add, we don't think that that technology neutral solutions are where it's at, right? So we don't want to use clean hydrogen to power school buses. We actually want to have solutions that Monique Harded with the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice has this 3 indicators that I think are quite beautiful, and I always try to pull out. And they are, will this energy source cause harm in communities? Does its production perpetuate racially disproportionate pollution burdens? And does the use of the energy source contribute to the climate crises? And so anything in the bill that gives us a yes to one or more of those questions, we think it's a bad idea.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And thank you for taking folks a little bit deeper, because sometimes folks like to think just because we say it's a part of the clean economy, then it must be good, without really unpacking all the possible impacts that are there and just overlaying that with the sets of opportunities. So I appreciate you, sister, taking us there. Teresa, same question. You're there in New Mexico. What are some of the things, and I know that you had mentioned that you're focusing on renewable energy portfolios in the information that you're sharing today. What would be some of the things that would be most helpful in that part of the country?
Well, here in the sunny Southwest, we find that the energy tax credit is beneficial. And in fact, it really was the foundation of building out our portfolio with wind and renewable energy, solar energy. We feel like, without the tax credits, it's really hard to build that foundation so that it could lead to other, policy ideas and commitments, and eventually, changes the state statute on the amount of renewable energy or the climate goals that our state wants to achieve. So it was really the energy tax credits that we had years ago that allowed us to build this foundation. And I will talk more about, what that did for us and how that stepping stone was really the beginning.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. We appreciate that. Let's Dana, let's go into this part of it. What challenges and opportunities do you foresee communities of color facing when they're seeking funding and resources through the Build Back Better agenda?
Yeah. So I do think, as I mentioned earlier, the challenge is for community-based organizations to really go deep in the work that they do and expand their capacity. We see that same thing happening if you look at entrepreneurship opportunities like our SONS program that I mentioned. But there are two big barriers that we have concerns around. One is having a process for accessing funds at the federal level that does not create a barrier to entry in the way it's implemented. And so we want to, and I'll give you an example. There is a tax credit, a solar tax credit being considered right now in the Ways and Means Committee that would be administered through the Department of Treasury. I don't know about y'all, but accessing the Department of Treasury for a program that if I am a young entrepreneur, a new entrepreneur, being able to access those funds, that in and of itself can be intimidating. So how do we take the intimidation out of these processes and make them accessible to people? Another concern that we have, quite frankly, is that process of pushing down of resources to states and being sure that that is a transparent process and that states, that there is protocol, processes, practices, infrastructure in place at the state level that will allow communities to be able to provide recommendations and insight and influence how that money gets used at the local level. I think the American Rescue Plan and Mobile, Alabama are a great example where that city got $53 million under the American Rescue Plan, and the mayor used $11 million of funds that was to go toward COVID relief for its citizens for one-time raises. We don't want to see that happen, right? We want to see that money come to folks who are impacted. And quite frankly, we want to see it come in a way that fulfills on President Biden's commitment to invest 40% of resources in our communities. So if that's an oversight board, if that is looking at laws, local laws, we want to be able to get in there and do all of that great work and make a difference. I sounded like a politician, didn't I?
No, you didn't. No, not at all. You sounded like you was just telling it like it is. So I appreciate that. We're going to unpack that state aspect here in a second, but I want to give our sister Teresa an opportunity to respond to the same question.
Let's see. This one's tough to talk about because this is when you peel back the onion and expose all the inequities in policies that should have had the right lens to begin with. So New Mexico has accomplished much in the way of renewable energy. In 2019, our legislature passed the Energy Transition Act. And that allowed us to move towards 100% renewable energy by 2045. And this was a utility targeted state policy. So we are the second sunniest state, and we have 2 national labs, that work on energy storage, and a state that is second in production of oil and gas. So this was not an easy sell to legislators. So where we found opportunity, the tax credits, like I mentioned before, that they provided sort of the basic stepping stone to transform our energy grid to become 100% renewable. Clean energy tax credits can be implemented at a state level, but coupled with a federal policy can really accelerate the transition. And that's what happened to us. 2, it creates economic development opportunities. But again, let's peel back that onion. So the challenges, the opportunities, of course, are big, but the challenges are many for low-income, non-white, and renter communities. So the tax credit or these incentives really do benefit higher income people. And I think that they knew that up front, that, only wealthy people were going to be able to buy solar panels for their homes. So housing construction and design might not be adequate to install solar panels. So that was another challenge. Investment benefit really didn't reach renters. And there were lots of very vulnerable communities that are vulnerable to predatory practices. Mm-hmm. And you need the Attorney General's office to intervene to be able to cure some of these deficiencies. So those are the primary challenges, and there are ways to cure that, or wrap policies around it to help prevent some of these things from happening. Working directly with communities, one-on-one is one strategy to do that, to develop wraparound policies. We also implemented a community solar policy that allowed renters to access renewable energy.
That's fantastic. Could you talk just a little bit more about how renters are better positioned to be able to engage in this new market, this new set of opportunities, especially around solar? Maybe you could just give us that 60-second on that.
Yeah. So if I mentioned the community solar policy at a state level can allow an owner of a building to purchase energy along with maybe another building, adjoining building, or it may be a group of homes. It may be a church that wants to allow the nearby neighborhood, to be able to access renewable energy from the one site. Say it's the church, the community church. Mm-hmm. So that particular policy is really meant to address equity.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Dana. I'm coming back to you. And I know you've done seen a few things since you've been in Washington, D.C., dealing with a number of folks, both on Capitol Hill and in these agencies. And you had mentioned the Treasury Department and the concerns, and those are most definitely valid concerns. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that communities also should have some additional concerns with the lack of capacity and competencies and some of these federal agencies that have not traditionally been operating in the environmental justice space? And just for context, for those who are watching who may not know all of us, I used to lead the interagency working group on environmental justice. And there were some agencies and departments, who were in pretty good, and then there were others who weren't. So now we've got a huge amount of resources that are going to be moving through a number of agencies. I'm going to turn it over to you, Sister Johnson, and let you unpack as much of that as you want to. And I don't want you to get in trouble. I can carry it, but you take us as far as you want to go.
Right. So, yeah, I think that is a beautiful, substantive question that I think we all have to look at. I think if we go back to January when President Biden signed Executive Order 14008 and made this decision to embed environmental justice in the operations of agencies and departments, with that came the recommendation that in a lot of them, there would be an environmental justice position. And some of them have them. And quite frankly, we have an awareness, and some people have voiced a critique that the individuals sitting in some of those roles don't necessarily come from community. And so they don't really understand it, right? Mm-hmm. And so we do think about it in that regard. And then we do think about the federal government from an efficiency perspective. So, we've been talking about it a lot in relation to like NEPA, and how do we move NEPA forward in a meaningful way? And we think about, how do you communicate with folks? Well, having me come into a federal building, having me come into the Department of Justice, or having me come into the Department of Treasury can be intimidating. That's not something that I want to do. And so we have to think even about how these agencies that have traditionally not done community engagement work, how do they do that in a meaningful way now? Like just with basic communications tools, right? How many of them use social media and newsletters and other vehicles to communicate with folks? Do they have relationships with people on the ground to even, be able to use them as a trust bridge or a trust broker? And the point that you made too about, and I'm just going to say it out loud, I might get in trouble. When we look at this budget reconciliation period and having to divert money or allocate money to existing programs as a way to be able to fund some of the initiatives, we're sending them to departments and agencies that don't necessarily have the bandwidth, the capacity, or the experience to be able to move large money in that way. And so, there is concern about the efficiency and the effectiveness of getting those resources out to the people who need them. Like you look at, we know Omega Wilson with West End Revitalization Association. He talks about his EPA office before the Trump administration had 13 people, I believe. Today they have 3, right? 3 people.
Right.
3 people.
And they were one of the larger ones. So there was others that had 1 person, 2 people for 5 or 6 states. So capacity has to change, competence have to change.
We have to set these agencies and departments up for success as a way to even manage our own expectations as people in the community.
I appreciate that. We're going to continue that bridge from the feds to the states here in a second, but I want to go back over to Teresa, and I want to talk just a little bit about the clean energy tax credits, because I don't think a lot of folks, I don't think they really actually know what that means. So my mom used to say, I need you to explain stuff to me like we getting on the elevator on the first floor. And when we get to the 10th floor, hopefully I got some basic understanding. So hopefully you could help us for those, because we do have some folks who are newer to the space. And of course, we have practitioners who are also with us today. Maybe you could help those who are newer have that basic understanding. Oh,
thank you. Yes, I know it's it's kind of an art to be able to mix technology and policy. And then what does that mean to my community? What does it mean to my household? What does that mean to my young children? It's just really hard to make the connections, especially when you have this solar panel thing, sitting on your roof. And, reminds me the days of the microwave when years ago, people didn't know, what is this? And oh my gosh, it boils something and I don't have to turn the stove on. So again, it's educating yourself about all this new technology. So I want to start out by saying that social equity must play a core role in shaping a just energy transition. And you can do this and understand it better by bringing it down to the local level, and you bring that technology down to the local level. And I mentioned this community solar idea where houses can connect to one building now and benefit from that savings and from that clean energy. And it means that there has to be more engagement with the impacted communities. It can't just be coming from a top-down conversation. It needs engagement. Examining how states are making investments, and I think Dana addressed this quite well. It's really understanding how who's benefiting here, like who owns these companies, and why are they coming into my neighborhood to sell me this product? I don't understand how they're going to do this because my house isn't set up for this. So there's not a lot of education for these communities to deploy this level of technology. So there certainly has to be more questions coming from organizations to help those communities understand what they're getting themselves into and what they're voting for, who's benefiting. And then you need policies to help address that and wrap policies around that to protect those communities. I also want to mention to be aware of the leapfrog syndrome. Make sure investments do not leapfrog over impacted communities. They need to be a lot more, they need to be involved. They need, the money just can't jump over them without them understanding where those investments are going. Addressing worker rights and utilizing minority-owned businesses, and Dana mentioned that. I set up my consulting company before I entered this policy position, and it was a renewable energy consulting company. And I didn't even know that I was like one of the few Latinas, in the country setting up a renewable clean energy consulting company. And I was just not really aware of it. I just naturally just did it. But again, just aware of that, leapfrog syndrome that communities can just get caught in.
Thank you for that. I want to tie a little bit of what you just shared. Also, Dana, I want to come back to you as we continue our bridge, moving past, the feds. We all know that when it comes to the states receiving dollars, and you talked a little bit about this earlier, that there can not be the same outcomes as people had thought would actually happen. And we know that can happen all across the country, but we know there are certain areas that, it may be more likely than others. So could you talk a little bit about, maybe we better try and combine this just because of time. What are the needs that need to be in place around accountability for the states and the county governments to make sure that dollars are actually reaching folks, and not only on the accountability side, but on the capacity building side as well?
Yes. So there are two things that we've been thinking about that I think fit in this bucket. One thing that when we think about implementation, we'll be advocating for is community, either advisory boards or environmental justice boards or justice 40 boards, whatever you want to call them. We think that there needs to be a group of community advocates who support states and cities or counties in visioning and deciding how these resources should be used or can be used. We think that and maybe it's a part of the federal process, but if you are an on the ground business doing work in a predominantly low to moderate income community or a community of color, you can't apply for that grant. You can't access those resources without having a meaningful, as Teresa mentioned, equitable relationship with a community group that is on the ground. You can't get to those resources. And then we think that they should be publicly reported, whether that's at the federal government level or at the state or county level. We think that I should be able to go to a database or visit an office or agency or department and ask for an annual accounting of how these resources were spent. This needs to be an open and transparent process.
Mm-hmm. Can you imagine billions of dollars moving to a state that does not have an environmental justice advisory committee or council? We know that there are literally only a handful of those that exist across the country. Where they do, some are doing some good work, mm-hmm. but to not have that seems like you are leaving a huge gap or a huge hole in the process. Right. What do you think about it?
I think that is accurate. So like, I know New York City, New York State has them and they work well. I know Virginia has a state advisory, EJ advisory board that was made permanent and works well. But I also have heard people say that, like, those boards need to be made up primarily of community folks, like, the balance of industry, community, and other sectors of society have to ensure that they weigh more toward those who would be impacted and benefit from the resources coming in. Mm-hmm. So mix matters.
No doubt. I hear what you're saying. Teresa, I want to come back over to New Mexico. With the question that we are unpacking, and you had mentioned earlier a little bit about 2019 and some of the things that New Mexico was moving forward on. Are there additional structural things that you feel should be in the states that would help to make sure not only that there's real accountability, but that we are truly helping the communities that need the help the most, whether on the renewable side of the equation, the agricultural side of the equation, or any other element that you'd like to highlight?
Oh, gee, that would take another 20 minutes to explain, but we're working at it. Our state system was weakened when we had a governor in power about 5 years ago that, one of the ways of weakening an environmental justice system is to not have policy councils. Not have councils set up that govern the way that we look at equity from all different levels of the state government, all agencies that cover health and human services and the environment and water, and we were weakened. So we've had to spend the last 4 years rebuilding that. Mm-hmm. And even with a strong policy, of strong renewable energy policy, you need to have appropriate funding for the agencies that need to monitor and to implement the policy, especially if it has to do with utilities, because there's a lot of oversight with utilities. So I think that we're doing better. We've built more councils that work on climate. There's a council that's working on food justice. So little by little, we'll rebuild. We will rebuild.
Thank you for that. It is a building process, and we all would like for it to happen really quickly, but we also know sometimes you got to take your time to make sure that it's done right. But hopefully we will have real accountability and the resources that will move, so that folks know if you're going to get these, then you have to be very serious and you got to do the right thing with it. So I appreciate that. Dana, I'm coming back to you.
Okay.
Let's get in some trouble together, and I'll take most of the weight.
You got to take the weight.
I'll take the weight.
Okay.
So, you know, you've been doing this for a while. I've been doing this for a while. There was a time when there were not a whole lot of folks who said that they were environmental justice organizations or that they worked on environmental justice or climate justice.
You want to get in trouble for real. All right. Here we go.
But now there's a lot of resources that are going to be out there. And how do we ensure that when dollars leave the feds and go to the states and counties and local governments, that the folks who are actually receiving the resources are those who have actually been doing the work?
Yes. Really big question. And I think we see it coming to life right now. We see the challenge of it in just sort of figuring out the advocacy and the policy part, because we have had organizations that have not traditionally been in the environmental justice space that, you know, get dollars for programs that, you know, EJ groups have been doing for a really long time. And I think that goes back to that notion of, you know, there needs to be a demonstrated relationship and there needs to be demonstrated work taking place in that area. And that needs to be looked at closely. So, you know, what programs has an entity been engaged in for, you know, XY period of time? Do they have some demonstrated advocacy wins that they've secured? Maybe there is, this would be a lot of work, but, you know, I don't know, I'm an ideas person sometimes, but, you know, maybe this equity board, this environmental justice advisory board, community folks, maybe there's a process where one would be engaged with that group as a part of a vetting experience or process. That could be difficult, but it just came to mind. And I think like that demonstrated relationship or connection to a community-based group could be one of the ways to do it. And the balance, the mix of how that funding and resources get allocated has to skew more toward the community-based group than it does, you know, a for-profit entity coming into communities. I think there's one other thing that I'll add to this. So, you know, there at the federal level, there is work being done around an environmental and climate justice screen that could also be a directive tool to be sure that money goes to the right place, to people who have been doing the work. But also the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council also put out recommendations in July that had some additional indicators that could be overlaid onto any, you know, local state process that would be more directive. And it could look at public health indicators. It could look at, you know, small business indicators, incubators in cities. It can look at disparate impacts in certain areas and look at how organizations and entities have been working in those spaces. And use those as, you know, metrics for determining if you are the right entity to be accessing these resources. It's going to take work, but we need for people to do the work.
Mhm. Most definitely. Most definitely. I think that you, myself, a whole bunch of others could tell you the top 200 organizations across the country who, in my estimation, are platinum certified. We don't have no problem in certifying buildings based upon a certain set of standards. So all that being said is that there are folks who've been doing the work, and we want to make sure that those folks are being honored with these sets of opportunities that we have in front of us. And I know that can take different forms and fashions, but if we're serious about prioritization, then, we can make it happen. And I'll leave it there so we don't take you too far down the rabbit hole. Teresa, coming back to you, and then Dana, I'm going to come right back to you with the same question. So, something that's incredibly important, and maybe you could share with folks what you'd like to see in this space. We have, however you want to label it, larger organizations, big green organizations, whatever label you might want to use. How can they make sure that they are truly being authentic allies in the work, Teresa, that you're doing? What would you like to see them doing in that space, and also helping to make sure that vulnerable communities are uplifted and that they are not contributing to any impacting in those communities, whether through policy or non-power sharing or non-sharing of resources?
Yes, that's a very good question. And when I entered into the environmental justice world, I think I entered it with the eyes of someone who was technically skilled. I have a master's in sustainability, and I had been a home builder for about, 15 years, and had a lot of experience working in the business environment, and had seen all the atrocities of the inequities in the workforce, in air pollution and polluted products, and I saw it all from the ground up. And when I entered the world of environmental work, my eyes were just so open, and I think I was in shock when we were beginning to mobilize this work around renewable energy in New Mexico. And I really, really had to take a look at what that picture looked like, after it was all deployed, or as it was being deployed, and all the inequities that really could happen in that long time frame. And really the original policy that was built, the Energy Transition Act, it didn't have enough social justice in it at all. It was purely technical, looking at climate change and only looking at climate change, only looking at emissions without that lens, that environmental lens. So I was just in the gut of it. And it turned out that when the policy passed, it did allow for funding to go into the affected communities that were going to lose their jobs from shutting down a coal-fired power plant. So that's like one of the high priority impact areas, is really where that coal plant is located. But as you dig deeper and into policy as it progresses, because you need a lot of different policies to really move forward a clean energy economy, you see inequities even in the small policies. And it has to do with those investments. Where are those investments going? Where are they going? And that's what I ask them to look at and work with the affected community. It's not just about the people in the state. It's about the people in the community, in the affected community.
Thank you for that. Dana, same question.
All right. Well, this is a big week, right?
Yes.
This week, we are commemorating the 30th anniversary of the first National People of Color Environmental Summit.
Mm-hmm.
And so my boss, Peggy Shepard,
Mm-hmm.
my dotted line mentor, Bernice Miller Travis, and who's also a co-founder of We Act for Justice, both of them are, participated in that gathering of environmental justice leaders from across this nation. And out of that was born the 17 principles of environmental justice.
Mm-hmm.
And quite frankly, I feel the tension in this moment of, national groups and other parties coming into this space and, working on issues of environmental justice. And it took me back to those 17 principles. If you are an organization working in this space, and if your work is not built upon a foundation of the 17 principles of environmental justice, you are not doing EJ work, right? You are not doing EJ work. And one that I continuously go back to is environmental justice demands the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision making. Mm-hmm. If you have measured out the ingredients, if you have assembled them, if you have put it in the oven and it's baking, and you say, hey, Dana, come and look, I'm making a cake, I'm going to give you a slice, you are not doing environmental justice work.
There it is. I appreciate that. So you can't make sweet potato pie unless you got the right ingredients in it, just so y'all understand what we're talking about. And then, of course, we better call out also the Jimenez principles, two of the driving foundational documents that if you want to know if you're beginning your journey of doing authentic work, whether we're talking about in relationship to the clean economy or to these other types of impacts that are happening in our communities, then you got to do the work. And if you've done the work, then at least the door is cracked for you to begin to come in, and folks going to take a peek to see what you done did, where you is. And yes, that's not proper English, but that's the way I'm breaking it down for y'all right now. Teresa, coming to you. So, we've got the Build Back Better plan, and then we've also got the bipartisan infrastructure. Are there elements that, let's leave the bipartisan where it is. Let's just focus on the Build Back Better. Are there additional pieces that you feel need to be a part of this process to make sure that we are helping communities to have a stronger foundation, to be made whole, in some instances to heal, and to be able to move forward in a direction that is truly built on power, equity, and justice?
Oh, that's another good question. There are just so many different ideas and parts and pieces in that bill that I think are going to make us more resilient. And I think I'd like to use that as my entry to what I'd like to say, only because I've been working lately in the agricultural resilience area. And I just wanted to mention that during COVID, there were a number of communities of color, and I think this was true for non-communities of color, where we had a food system breakdown, and it was really serious. And we could not get local food directly to impacted communities, folks that were out of jobs and really couldn't get to a grocery store or, for whatever reason. So we had this broken food system, and we feel that we need better infrastructure in order to deliver locally grown food to communities of color, because it is needed. It's important. And if we ever have a pandemic, we have to be ready. So we need funding from that Build Back Better to strengthen our food infrastructure system throughout the United States.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Dana, we got universal health care that's in there. We got pre-K stuff. Hopefully the elder care is still in there. It changes, so you got to really keep your eye on it. Are there other things based upon the work that you do, that WEAC does, that would be helpful, that if we don't get it in here, hopefully we would find a way, but if not, that we should still be advocating for?
Sure. I think Teresa brought it up, made mention of the worker in this process and transition. And last year, I'm losing track of time, so it may have been 2 years ago, we released a green jobs report. And actually, Cecil Corbin-Mark was instrumental in the development of that report. But we wanted to take a look at what was needed holistically to transition workers from one, industry to another within the energy sector, and how do we do that in a just and equitable way. And I was in a meeting with Roxanne, and I can't remember her last name, with IBW, and she talked about, if you are an $85,000 a year employee in right now in fossil fuel, whether you work in oil, gas, or coal, that's a concern for you. So how do we transition people in an equitable and just way? And there are 4 points that we identified. One, we need to earmark funds to support workers as they transition from one sector to another. So how do we support continuity and income as you train and get prepared? We need to protect pension funds. Like, we can't let those go out the window, or the CEOs take them with them in this as places shut down. We need to make sure that people have health insurance. So, we'll be advocating for that. Going back to that idea of advisory boards, which isn't necessarily in this package, but we need to be advocating for community engagement and involvement in what the new vision for an area would look like when one industry goes away. We certainly need monies to repurpose abandoned facilities and sites. And then we need to provide wraparound services, as were mentioned, so that people don't have the worry or concern about their households and their community in mind as they get prepared for the next phase.
I appreciate that. And that was powerful. So, we began this journey and we talked a little bit at the beginning about some of the things that we want to make sure are not in there. And we just touched on that real quickly. If we're going to have real talk and we're going to have a real conversation about opportunities and technologies and all these other types of things that are often associated with jobs and job ownership, there have been some strong sticking points around carbon taxes, around carbon capture, around, a suite of different types of things. So my mom always says that the way you start is the way you should finish, because people will remember that. Teresa, I'm just going to ask if there are any things that are inside of there that the current sets of bills that you feel will not be helpful to the communities that you serve.
Oh, not be helpful. I don't know how to answer that question. I think I have a big concern. And my concern is this money going to trickle down to those communities that aren't in need? And, are there enough mechanisms in our state, as well as others, that will allow that funding source to reach those communities? It's that leapfrog syndrome that I am very worried about. So I don't know what details are in that bill to assure that money trickles down.
And I like the way you frame that. Dana, I'm coming to you. Any big concerns that maybe you have not yet had an opportunity to highlight that the hundreds of people who are watching will have a better understanding of of why those are concerns.
Yeah, I think for us, there is this singular focus on reducing carbon, and we say we need to have a multi-pollutant focus. If we just focus on carbon, it allows some technology neutral solutions to come in play, like carbon capture and sequestration. And we think that those really just prolong our dependence on fossil fuels, and they do little to clean up the air in our community. They do little to reduce the other pollutants, and we want to breathe.
Well, you know what? Maybe we should end on that with, it should be a human right to be able to breathe clean air, a human right to be able to drink clean water that is affordable. And maybe also as we move down this road with our clean economy, that it should be a human right to be able to also access energy sources that don't have additional impacts in our communities and actually give a true set of opportunities for folks who have often been disinvested in an opportunity to have real investments in their communities that are transformative. With that being said, Teresa, Dana, I want to thank you both so much. And now I want to pass the mic to my brother, Justin, whom, if you have not had an opportunity to follow his work, this brother has worn a whole bunch of different hats in a whole lot of different places trying to be a part of making positive change happen. He's right now with the League of Conservation Voters. And I would be remiss, as I pass the mic to you, Justin, to not say that if we care about what's happening in environmental justice communities, if we care about a clean economy, then you have got to get engaged in the civic process. And you got to make sure that you're protecting people's right to vote. Because if we don't do that, we will never be able to achieve many of these very important things that we've been discussing tonight. So Justin, if you are on the screen, I want to pass the mic to you so you could drop some wisdom on us for the next few minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mustafa. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you all for having me. My name is Justin Kwasi, he, him pronouns, from League of Conservation Voters, talking to you from Washington, D.C., so Piscataway land. Definitely want to put my land acknowledgement in there. So thank you for the original owners of this land. Yes, listening to this conversation, what keeps on coming up is that we have systematic inequities that we know in many ways that we have to deal with. But what I want to do was to quickly talk about kind of what is the source of that. And that is kind of inequitable representation in our democracy. Look, as League of Conservation Voters, we think that a healthy environment needs to have a healthy democracy. We believe that everybody wants clean air, clean land, clean water, but yet because we have a democracy that doesn't work, that is inequitable, that is why we don't see the results that actually reflect the people that make up the democracy. And if you really want to get back to the source of where all this inequity comes from and this environmental injustice comes from, it comes from the very beginning from our democracy. From the very beginning, the communities of color that are most affected by environmental inequity, the Black communities, the Latinx communities, the Asian American communities, the Native communities, did not from the very beginning of our democracy have a seat at the table. You and me, Mustafa, according to our own constitution, we're 3/5 of people, right? So if throughout the years, because communities of color have not had representation at the table, or even when it was available, they still did not have access to the ballot. They still didn't have access to choose their leadership. We have seen decades and decades and generations of inequities build and people being able to take advantage of because our communities have not had the ability historically to choose their leadership, to choose people who truly do represent them. And that's why we see the inequities that we see today and that we've talked about for the past hour on this conversation. So what are we going to do about it? So this is where I want to come in. First of all, let me take a step back and say that at the League of Conservation Voters, I am the Voting Rights Program Director. And so what I do is make the connection between giving people the ability to vote and making those changes in our democracy. And so what I want to do is talk to you about some of the democracy bills that we as an environmental coalition are really focusing on in order to make sure that our environmental justice communities have a voice at the ballot when it comes time to vote, and can choose leadership that will truly represent them and create the changes that we need. Right now, there are three main bills that we're really focusing on the federal level. So the first one is the what used to be called the For the People Act, but is now called the Freedom to Vote Act. And so what this does is this creates national standards, national best practices that all 50 states as well as territories can use in order to make sure that voting is as accessible to people as possible. So that means automatic voter registration. That means online voter registration. That means making sure that early voting is available for 2 weeks before Election Day, including weekends, so that people actually have multiple ways that they can cast ballots. I think one thing that we've seen from the pandemic is that voting cannot happen on just one random Tuesday in November. It needs to happen in multiple times, multiple ways. And we can do these all in a safe and secure way in order to make sure that everybody can have their voices heard in our democracy, but we can do it in a safe way that doesn't have multiple votes or voter fraud that we know doesn't actually exist. And so that's one thing that they're doing. So number one, the For the People Act does that in terms of make sure that all the best practices we know for an equitable voting system can be implemented across all states so that we don't have 50 different voting systems happening all across the country. But it also has additional measures like the Disclosure Act that kind of tries to expose dark money and other forms of money that affect how our elected officials are making decisions, and kind of brings that to light. And then finally, what it does is actually has redistricting components, which right now we are all in the process in each of our states of redrawing maps every 10 years in order to figure out in both our state legislatures as well as Washington, D.C., who is representing who? Who is representing what communities, I should say. And so we also need that legislation in order to make sure that those districts are drawn in the most equitable ways so that our communities of color are actually represented and they're not drawn in a way that disperses and takes away their actual voice in our democracy. So all of these add up to once again, a democracy that truly does represent the people and not the corporate interests, not the polluter interests, and not the other interests that have led to all these inequities that we've talked about. So that's the For the People Act. The second thing that we're advocating for is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So just a quick little history lesson. Throughout the Civil Rights Movement, kind of the two big pieces of legislation were the Civil Rights Act, but also the Voting Rights Act. And what the Voting Rights Act did was it allowed the courts to be a backdrop to say that, hey, if a law was passed in any of these jurisdictions that both either intentionally or kind of by a roundabout way discriminate against people of colors, you could take it to court and the courts could look over it, figure out if this was actually a discriminatory voting law and eliminate that from the beginning. In addition, there were some jurisdictions, particularly in the South, or jurisdictions that have a history of racial discrimination, where any voting law that they passed, it would automatically go to the court just straight up. And the courts could actually determine if it was discriminatory, and if it was, they would eliminate it so that we didn't have this constant back and forth in terms of protecting people's voting rights. It would happen from the very beginning, and it would never even make it to law. Well, in the past 10 years, there have been 2 Supreme Court decisions that have taken away a lot of those protections that are in the Voting Rights Act. And so what we have done is we've reintroduced it to bring back the full protection of that act, but also add additional language in order to show and in order to protect against all the new ways that people's rights to vote have been discriminated against. Back then, you could just straight out say that, oh, if you're Black, you couldn't vote. You can't do that today, but we can say, if you do or don't have an ID, if you do live in a certain place. There are all these other ways that people can get around in order to restrict people's rights to vote, but not say that it's directly targeted towards communities of color. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing that we're doing, which a lot of folks may not necessarily think is a voting rights issue or come up on people's radar, but is extremely important, is DC statehood. And the reality is in DC, where I live, we are 700,000 people who are American citizens. We pay taxes. Yet, even though Congress is in our city, we do not have any representation in Congress. We do not have a voting representative in the House of Representatives, and we don't have senators. And so one of the clearest examples of voter suppression is that in a city that used to be called Chocolate City, they do not have any congressional representation. That is kind of the clearest and most overt example of voter suppression that we've seen. And so we're doing all this to say, in order to make the changes and the environmental justice changes we need to do, folks, we need to not play checkers, we need to play chess. And so not only should we be doing all the work that we've talked about for the past hour, we also need to do the work in order to change the actual game that all of these decisions are being made in. And so being able to make sure that our democracy is more representative of all people is key in order to making sure that the environmental justice protections that we all need, we want, and make accessible to all the communities that we care about really do start with voting. And so really asking you that in addition to the work that you're doing with environmental justice, to continue to make sure that people have the ability to vote, both in your own towns and countries, and also across the country, in order to make sure that our laws and our elected officials are truly representing the people. And with that, Mustafa, I want to give it back to you to close out us out. And definitely feel free to reach out to me at League of Conservation Voters if you have any additional questions about how you can get involved on the voting rights and voting registration side of this battle. Thank you, guys.
There it is. Justin dropping some fire on folks. I hope y'all was catching what he was giving to you. You know, my grandmother says that you have power unless you give it away. So we need to be able to utilize that power. We need to utilize that power to make sure that every person in this country has a fair and equitable opportunity to be able to vote. So we got to put the right things in place. We got power to have a just transition, to make sure that nobody gets left behind, and that we can create literally millions of new jobs. But we got to make sure there's real accountability in that space. And we got to make sure that we're utilizing our power also to stand in authentic partnership and allyship with frontline organizations as we move forward on this clean economy, to make sure that, you know, their visions for us moving forward are being honored in that space. So don't forget that you have power. Let's use it in the right way. And with that being said, I am going to turn it over to my sister, Gabby Rivera, who's going to take us home. And Gabby, right before I do that, I just want to also honor one thing that I saw in the chat. To make sure there was a question that if folks are already pulling together some projects, well, what we do with that, Mustafa? So Gabby has already shared some information. I think she's going to bring it back to you again here in a second. And then also there are amazing organizations and networks that are already out there across the country that you can plug into with around those projects and see if there's some synergies. So with that being said, Gabby, let me turn the mic over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gabby Rivera. I'm the Environmental Justice Coordinator for the team, and you can email me with any questions that you might have after this conversation. I've put my email into the chat a few times, but if you missed it, it's riverag@nwf.org. And I just wanted to uplift the CECC listserv one more time. It's an optimal platform to share opportunities, updates, and receive information on resources that can help build capacity and power amongst our communities. If you want to be included on the CECC listserv, please add your email and name into the chat or into the Q&A section, or you can also email me directly with your name and email so we can add you. We're going to be collecting all the resources and information shared this evening and distributing it via the listserv in a few weeks after this call. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone, all the panelists and audience members for joining us today for our discussion on the Build Back Better agenda and its impact on communities of color. And we want to thank you again and wish you a nice evening.